Canto 22 begins very much where Canto 21 left off, with these now three souls journeying together, Dante, Virgil and Statius. And it occurred to me after I recorded my thoughts on Canto 21 that Dante really does quite completely, quite perfectly portray the communion of these three souls. And I thought about it afterwards and wondered if it can be put in this way. That on the one hand, there's a kind of threefold communion going on within each soul separately. And this would be the part of them that yearns for the divine, the part of them that falls away from the divine because their will, their love, their desire gets distracted, but also the part of them that already carries the divine. You might remember there's been this allusion to the story of Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well in Samaria and being told that there's an eternal fountain that she can gather water from and so quench her thirst for all eternity. Well, the implication is that we carry that eternal fountain within us, and that when we find it, we can turn to it and draw water from it. So we have this kind of threefold structure within ourselves, and I think it's a really good model for understanding our own attempts to become more and more aligned with the divine, to think about these elements within ourselves and not how we cut off the part that falls away from the divine, but how we bring that in to relationship with the eternal fountain, so that this threefold structure within us becomes one, becomes all aligned to the divine. Because then, of course, we have the fullest extent of ourselves that can begin to mirror and echo and reflect the fullest extent of divine life too. So that's one way in which this Trinitarian structure was showing up really rather wonderfully in the previous canto. But there's another way in which I realise now, I think more on it, that it was showing up too. Because in a way, each of the three plays the part of what you might call the pre-transformed, the bit that falls away, the transforming, the bit that's on the journey, on the pilgrimage, and also the transformed, the bit that is already with divine life, plays that part for each of the other. There's a wonderful sort of weaving and mirroring, a dance almost going on, which I think explains why this communion is so profound and so lovely at the end of Canto 21. Let me just unpack that a little bit more. If you think about, say, Dante as a transforming soul, well, Virgil has been his guide. So Virgil, in that aspect, has already been in touch with divine life, and so is transformed. But Virgil, of course, is also the pagan poet who has sort of sensed divine life in limbo, but been unable to reach it, so is pre-transformed as well. Statius, too, we now know is transformed. He has served his time on Purgatory and so has aligned his will to the divine. But we've also learned that he's a pagan poet, so he can carry that pre-transformed aspect as well for Dante. When we come to Virgil as a transforming soul, well, Dante plays both the part of the transformed individual because Dante is a Christian, but also the pre-transformed individual because Dante's having to undergo the journey to know what divine life is like. And similarly for Virgil, Statius plays both aspects as well. Statius is both transformed because he has aligned his will with God, but also he's a pagan poet, so is pre-transformed. In fact, was born, we have been led to believe so far, without knowing even about Christ. That's going to change somewhat in this canto, but let me just complete all these triads. And when you think of Statius then as a transforming soul, which incidentally he's still doing, because although he's aligned his will now with divine will, he's still got a huge amount more to learn, which is part of the joy of heaven. It doesn't all suddenly stop. But nonetheless, he's, if a transforming soul, Virgil, who, as we're going to discover very dramatically, was the one that led him to see these deeper truths than just his pagan past might have allowed. Virgil plays, therefore, the transformed soul for Statius, but also Virgil is a pagan poet still, so has, as it were, part of him this pre-transformed state. And then Dante too, just to complete the picture. Dante is a Christian, so stands for the transformed aspect of humanity, but is on the journey, so too can carry within him the pre-transformed aspects. So, when they're talking, when they're communing, it's as if they sort of will see in each other both their own current state of transformation, but also the possibility that they too could be transformed, but also where they've come from, their pre-transformed aspects as well. And, it's that tremendous richness that brings, I think, the extraordinary fullness of the vision that Dante is now really trying to communicate with us in the drama, in the hints, in what's more explicit, as he's going to continue to develop. I think what we see by focusing on the inner story, constantly asking ourselves, what's going on for these individuals, not just what we've been told on the surface, pushing through from the literal to the allegorical, to the tropological element, where we too sort of wake up and think, oh my goodness, this is such an extraordinary picture that's being presented to us, in the hope that we as well might become transformed. And I think Dante, at the beginning of Canto 22, to come to this canto now, does underline this, because he says that as they're moving along the terrace, where they've all met, they come to the staircase that's going to lead to the next terrace, and they hardly notice the angel that's there. Now, the angel is there, as angels do. It performs its duty. It wipes another pea from Dante's forehead as they leave the terrace behind. But it's very striking that at the beginning of Canto 22, Dante just says, oh, and by the way, the angel was there. Because previously, he has been terrified by the angels, he's been blinded by the angels, he's been able to bear but their radiance, but still being deeply struck by it. Whereas now, I think because the three of them are so caught up in this divine life together, Dante hardly notices the angel, as though, nonetheless, they move off the terrace where they've met, continuing to journey together, Statius staying with them, I think, in his Christ-like aspect, you might say, that he's joining them much like Christ joined the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. There's also, I think, a bit of an element of the bodhisattva to bring in the Buddhist type as well, the bodhisattva who is enlightened but stays amongst the unenlightened in order to guide them. There's something of that in Statius is staying with Dante and Virgil, but it enables us to see, as I hope I've managed to convey, the wonderful nature of this inner transformation, which so profoundly takes off when thinking of things as dyads, me and my problems, me and God. How am I going to sort of wrestle with that? And you introduce the element of the third, and suddenly there's more breathing space, suddenly there's a new dynamic. They've been so joyously celebrating, because as the angel also utters part of a beatitude, blessed are those who thirst after righteousness, they hardly hear that as well, because they are actually feeling the bliss, the blessedness, the happiness of thirsting after righteousness. So the beatitude just kind of echoes around them rather than bringing something to consciousness for them, because they're fully conscious of it. The joyousness continues because Dante remarks that climbing up the stairs now has been easier than it has heretofore on Mount Purgatory. He can walk with lightness of foot now, and this is the levity that has become now a more significant element within him than the gravity which otherwise would hold him back and down. He's in a more spiritual state of mind, and when we feel in a more spiritual state of mind, when we see the vision, when we feel the bliss, life becomes lighter too. We can walk on, we have more energy because we're sharing in the divine energy. Virgil and Statius now turn and talk to each other. And in fact, most of Canto 22 is concerned with what happens between Virgil and Statius. And very remarkable it is too. They say, look, we've got some time to talk while we walk. Um, Time is never a trivial thing in purgatory. If you devote time to something in purgatory, it really matters. It is about your transformation. So Dante, the poet, is signalling that what's going to go on between Virgil and Statius is really crucial. And it's also interesting that their exchanges now are marked by smiles at each other as much as the words that they say. And certainly at this point, I'm wondering whether smiles are one of the ways that Dante the poet indicates new revelations, fresh insights that just weren't really conceivable before, that come to light because of the way that they're all transforming, they're all learning to drink from the eternal fountain within them. So what happens first of all is that Virgil expresses his love for Statius, even though they hadn't known each other in life. Virgil explains that when he's been in limbo, souls who have joined him there, other pagan poets, have told him about Statius, and in particular about how Virgil himself, had inspired Statius. And so Virgil says, my love was kindled for you even while I was in limbo. Maybe that's another reason why Virgil had said to Statius, don't bow before me, don't greet me formally in that way, with a kind of reverential hug. We're already equals here. My love for you had been kindled in limbo. Virgil then has a question for Statius, and he says, look, I hope our recently expressed friendship can tolerate this question. But Virgil says, I wouldn't have expected to see you, Statius, on the terrace of the avaricious, because from what I knew of your great gifts in life, why would you possibly want more? You knew of the richness of your insight that you expressed in your poetry. So how come you're with those who are mourning that they had clung to worldly goods so much? They hadn't shared them as you had done in your poetry. And Statius replies with what is a tremendous revelation, because he says, well, actually, I was on this terrace because of my prodigality, precisely because I was a bit too free and easy with giving away the gifts that I had, the insights that I could share, the good things of earth and heaven that I gained glimpses of through my art and craft. Now, this seems like, oh well, a bit of an extension of the terrace, and the avaricious and the prodigal are there together. But it actually represents a profound transformation of the ideas that the medieval Christian would have had about the sins that, as it were being cleansed on the terrace of the avaricious. Because avaricious and prodigality were not linked in the Christian tradition. They were linked in the Aristotelian tradition, because there you have Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, so called, the idea that virtue is found between the two extremes of its counterpart vices. So, for example, courage is somewhere in between timidity, running away, and foolhardiness, running right into the centre of things. It's a kind of art to be virtuous. And we already recently heard about how anger is between the extreme of just not caring at all and overwhelming wrath. There's a kind of righteous anger that can navigate that energy into making a difference. So Dante is now saying that this terrace of purgatory, if not in fact purgatory as a whole, is structured by Aristotle's insights. He is completely extending the Christian tradition, if not partly overturning it altogether. And this is continuing these extraordinary revelations, which had begun maybe at the foot of Mount Purgatory, with Cato being there to greet them. I think we'd actually already seen it in the Inferno, as we remarked on a number of occasions. So for example, it had been sort of signalled that we were going to greet a whole load of sodomites in one of the Bolgia of Malebolgia, and yet when we got there, we realised that actually it was something else that they were wrestling with down in that state of mind. This is another occasion where Dante really profoundly shakes up, extends, amplifies, and I think takes the Christian vision of things right to this threshold of new, transformed insights about the nature of divine life. Appropriate that he does that now here. You know, we're fairly high up Mount Purgatory. We're just about to get to the penultimate terrace, and these elements are going to accelerate heretofore, particularly around central Christian insights, such as the cross. Remember, we've had an intimation of that even, that the cross wasn't some kind of blood sacrifice required for a vengeful God, but was itself a passion in the true sense, a cleansing that by sharing in the sorrow, the suffering, the fullest extent of the passion of Christ, we too can be cleansed and changed and transformed through that deep lament, echoing, of course, what had happened all the way through Inferno. Seeing the extent of reality is a really important part of being able to reach all the transcendent aspects of reality as well. I just add that, of course, in the Inferno, we met the avaricious and the prodigal together. If you remember, they were kind of jousting, constantly bumping into each other. The opposites there, not learning from each other, as Aristotle would advise, but feeling they're just in perpetual conflict. Now the souls can think and understand. Again, that third aspect has been introduced, that they can reflect on their experience, almost sort of look down on their experience, as if with divine eyes, and so learn from it. Statius incidentally also adds that people are going to be shocked that prodigality is itself something that stops you from immediately being able to enter paradise. You know, giving everything away willy-nilly might seem like a good thing. We think, oh my goodness, they're so generous. But that can be as much a distraction as holding on to things. Statius now tells Virgil. It's a question of balance, not just because, you know, balance in itself is a kind of good thing, but because we must learn to enjoy things aright if we're going to become capable of heaven. And that begins here on earth with the good things around us. We are invited to delight and enjoy in them, but with this dynamic that enables us to constantly move into more, to kiss the joy as it flies, and so live in eternity's sunrise. But if Statius, by introducing this Aristotelian insight, has almost said that making mistakes, falling short, is part of the pathway to heaven, nothing which would shock Christians then and now, Virgil wants to ask a further question. And as he puts it, he says, but how was it that you have become a follower of the fisherman? And the fisherman there refers to Christ. Statius has just been released as his will has aligned with the divine will. So he has become clearly a follower of the fisherman. And Virgil wants to know, you know, when did this happen? And with his more literal old self, he's saying, didn't this need to happen before you died in order that you can find your way to this place? And Statius shocks Virgil again by saying, it was you that revealed the way of the fisherman to me. And what Statius had read was one of Virgil's eclogues, the fourth eclogue. And in that eclogue, Virgil prophesies that a new age will come or return, because a new progeny will descend from heaven. Statius says to Virgil, through you I was both poet and Christian. And he goes on to explain more, because he says what happened was that this kind of kindled an interest in the still emerging Christian dispensation. Statius lives at the end of the 1st century AD, and he noticed the apostles of those decades and what they were saying, and in fact was secretly baptized and admired the apostles, particularly under the persecution of Domitian, which occurred in the 80s AD. And so although he was, on the face of it, a pagan poet, he was secretly a Christian. this is being amazingly contrasted now with Virgil, who, though on the face of it was a pagan poet, was also explicitly transmitting Christian truth. So you've got the sense now that the meeting of these two pagan poets enables a wonderful joining of the dots, which of course is very much what Purgatory is about. That by seeing each other and hearing each other's stories told, they can complete what they half intimated in their earthly lives. Dante does it dramatically, I think, to illuminate for us that little bit more how Virgil is working out his own salvation and what it might mean to work out our own salvation too, to become fully capable of heaven, not just be God's saved robots. You know, you might say in some ways that Virgil has a kind of advantage here because he hasn't just automatically received baptism by virtue of being born in the Christian period, which, whilst it is a blessing, might leave you rather ignorant of the ways of God because you might feel you haven't really got to wrestle with them. I think this falls into the tradition of what are sometimes called Nicodemite Christians, after Nicodemus in John's Gospel, who comes to Jesus, we're told, by night. And what's so interesting about that encounter is that Jesus tells Nicodemus secrets about his mission, his ministry, that don't get so readily communicated to those who are with Jesus by day. In particular, Nicodemus learns that Jesus is bringing a spiritual rebirth, and they must be born again of the Spirit, not just their physical birth. And the implication is that Nicodemus understands that. And so Virgil and Statius too are beginning to understand what you might call secrets that haven't been so evident within Christianity heretofore. Statius then asks Virgil about other pagan poets who are in limbo, and Virgil names some. Very interestingly, he also names a group of virtuous women who are in limbo, including the figure of Manto, the prophetess. Now, this leaps out at commentators because Manto's actually been mentioned in the Bolgia of the Inferno with the diviners, if you remember, the individuals who tried to look forward and so now were condemned to always look backwards, even as they walked forwards, where Dante had wrestled with this business of divination, which of course he too is about in writing the Divine Comedy. So it's just interesting that Manto appears both in Limbo and further down in the Inferno. Commentators sometimes say this is just a sort of error on Dante's part. I think that actually it fits that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye in these texts. And if you try and read them literally and put it together like a tight-fitting jigsaw puzzle, you end up with a kind of one-dimensional model that doesn't actually really fit together very well and has screaming anomalies, a bit like Manto. But if you see it as a kind of 3D or 4D puzzle, that when the bits don't fit together at one level, it's because you're going to be invited to piece them together at another level and another level and another level, then that struggle to see in 4 dimensions reveals the deeper truths of the Divine Comedy. And so maybe this strange bilocation of Manto just hints, in passing almost, at that. So they've climbed up the stairs now as they've been talking, using that time so valuably. And Virgil remarks that the sun is now in the sky, telling them it's mid-morning. Virgil says, look, we should proceed along this terrace, keeping our right sides to the outer fall, our left sides to the side of the mountain. So interesting that Virgil offers the advice of how to proceed. He's guiding them. And Statius, though, does give it his blessing. He gives it his nod and says, yes, that's right. And they walk along on a new terrace and suddenly come across a strange tree. Now, the tree is described as, I think, being planted in the ground, as you would expect a tree, but at the base of the trunk, the branches are close together. And as it goes further and further up the trunk, the branches splay out more and more and more. So it looks a bit inverted, rather than the branches at the top being closer together and becoming wider and wider and wider as you come to the base of the trunk. Incidentally, in some commentators say that it's an inverted tree with the roots in the air, but I don't think, as far as I can see in the text, that's what it implies. Rather, it just implies that it's got this inversion because the branches closer to the base are narrower, whereas the branches higher up are wider. And the tree is said to be by the mountain of Purgatory, and into its upper widespread branches fall water. And we will learn that this is water coming from Eden at the top of Mount Purgatory. And it's just so interesting that this tree appears to them now, receiving waters from Eden, which of course is a pre-Christian time. Even as they've been talking about the insights of the pre-Christian period and how that too became full of what was going to become the Christian dispensation, the Christian insights, even as people only half knew it, they come across a tree which is feeding off you might say, the pre-Christian waters of Eden. What happens is that a voice comes from the tree. It's as if the tree speaks itself, and the voice says you can't eat from its fruit or drink of the water that's falling down it. It sounds a bit like the voice of Eden that said don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But I think that's actually perhaps more directly setting us up for what we're going to encounter on this terrace, which is the terrace of the gluttonous, to use the quick label. And of course what they must learn is that there's a much richer sustenance that can satisfy their hunger, the waters from Eden, the fruit of the heavenly tree. And so they must pass this tree and resist that now, whilst they burn off, work out their earthly gluttony that they must leave behind, but with which they try to satisfy themselves upon earth. The tree then also speaks of various exemplars of individuals who actually did manage to do that on earth. So it says there's Mary, who, when she called for the wine at the wedding of Cana, didn't think to quaff it herself. It talks of the women of Rome, who were said to be happy to drink water rather than wine. Again, a nice comparison there between Mary and the women of Rome. And then also of Daniel, who was said to be able to fast, and that was linked to his divination, in fact, to his ability to prophesy and foretell things. Then, as if to underline the profound blurring of the pagan and the Christian that this canto has so played with, both in the exchanges between Virgil and Statius and also in the very structure of the mountain of Purgatory itself. The tree says, to conclude the canto, that the golden age of ancient humanity was a time where when people knew how to eat and drink from nature's good, nature's bounty, and so see God. And it also says how John the Baptist understood this when he went into the wilderness and ate the locusts and honey. John the Baptist, of course, not being a Christian himself. And some commentators note, and this very much chimes with my sense of things, John the Baptist is seen here as analogous to Virgil, because both of them weren't Christians, and yet both of them, in their words, foretold of the fullness of the Christian dispensation. These kind of parallels are so important because they move us away from the literal towards the tropological, which transforms our vision of things, as we've so profoundly enjoyed, I hope, in Canto 22.